If you care about real history rather than romanticized survival myths, this is a channel you should be subscribed to, and I want you to comment as you watch because this discussion matters. On After the Sirens, we dig into what actually worked and what quietly got people killed. Today we are dismantling some of the most repeated World War II survival advice that sounds clever, looks heroic, and was deadly in practice. These tips still circulate in documentaries, prepper forums, and popular history books, yet wartime records, civilian defense manuals, and post-war investigations tell a far darker story. This video is not about dismissing wartime resilience. It is about understanding how desperation, misinformation, and propaganda shape decisions that cost lives. If you want to understand survival through evidence rather than myth, stay with me. Why survival advice in wartime was often shaped by fear, propaganda, and limited information. World War II civilians were bombed, displaced, starved, and cut off from reliable communication. Governments issued guidance quickly, often without testing it under real conditions. Civil defense pamphlets prioritized morale and order as much as safety. Rumors spread faster than corrections. People followed advice not because it was correct, but because it was authoritative, familiar, or emotionally comforting. Understanding this context is essential because it explains why certain survival tips became widespread, even when evidence later showed they increased casualties. Staying indoors during air raids was often more dangerous than fleeing at the wrong time. One of the most repeated instructions during early bombing campaigns was to remain inside homes during air raids. This advice was rooted in World War I experiences, where explosives were smaller and buildings more resilient. In World War II, aerial bombs were vastly more powerful. In cities like Hamburg, Dresden, London, and Tokyo, staying inside wooden or brick residential buildings dramatically increased the risk of collapse, firestorms, and suffocation. Practical application today means understanding structural risk rather than obeying blanket shelter advice. Wartime survivors who lived often moved to reinforced basements, underground shelters, or natural depressions away from structures. The lesson is not to panic and flee blindly, but to evaluate construction materials, proximity to fuel sources, and escape routes before danger arrives. Survival comes from situational assessment, not rigid obedience. Blackout compliance sometimes actually increased civilian casualties rather than preventing them. Blackouts, well, they were intended to prevent enemy bombers from navigating by city lights. But in practice, blackout conditions caused thousands of accidental deaths from falls, vehicle collisions, and delayed medical response. Emergency services, they really struggled to operate. Factories, on top of that, saw spikes in workplace injuries. And in some areas, bombers navigated using rivers, coastlines, and industrial landmarks anyway. The modern application really is understanding trade-offs in crisis response. Risk reduction in one area can, unfortunately, magnify risk elsewhere. Survivors who adapted blackout rules intelligently, using shielded lights indoors or marking stairwells discreetly, reduced secondary deaths. Blind compliance without local adjustment, though, proved fatal. Survival, in the end, requires flexibility and feedback, not ideological purity. Hoarding food improperly, well, it led to poisoning, illness, and malnutrition. Civilians were told to hoard whenever possible, yet honestly few were taught safe storage methods. Improperly stored grains developed mold toxins. Meat preservation without adequate salt caused bacterial outbreaks. Root cellars sometimes flooded or froze. In occupied territories, entire families died from consuming spoiled reserves months after stockpiling them. Applied practically, this teaches that possession does not equal security. Modern preparedness must prioritize rotation, preservation knowledge, and nutritional balance. World War II survivors who lived longest practiced ration discipline, shared storage knowledge communally, and diversified food sources. Hoarding without expertise creates delayed risk that often strikes when options are gone. Remaining silent and invisible was not always the safest choice under occupation. Popular survival lore emphasizes total invisibility under occupation. In reality, extreme isolation increased vulnerability. Individuals who avoided all contact had no access to warnings, food networks, or escape routes. In occupied Europe, survival often depended on limited, carefully chosen cooperation within trusted community circles. The lesson is controlled visibility. Survivors cultivated small, resilient social networks rather than total withdrawal. Applied today, this means building trust before crises, not after. Absolute isolation sounds safe, but removes the very information flow that enables survival. Trusting uniforms and official markings often proved, well, fatal. Many civilians believed uniforms guaranteed legitimacy. This assumption led to mass arrests, executions, and deportations when occupying forces used stolen or falsified insignia. Resistance archives document repeated cases where civilians followed instructions because authority symbols felt reassuring. Modern survival thinking must really emphasize verification over appearance. Survivors learn to cross-check information, delay compliance when possible, and rely on multiple confirmations. Authority is not safety, evidence is safety. Treating wounds at home without escalation, honestly, cost lives. Home medical advice encouraged civilians to treat injuries themselves to avoid overwhelming hospitals. This led to untreated infections, internal bleeding, and preventable amputations. Wartime medical reviews show survival improved dramatically when civilians sought care early, even under dangerous conditions. The practical lesson here is, well, knowing escalation thresholds. Self-reliance is not the same thing as isolation. The survivors who made it through understood when a problem was just too big for home treatment, and they acted decisively. Moving constantly to avoid danger, often increased exposure. Some advice at the time urged people to keep relocating to stay ahead of threats. But in bombing zones and combat corridors, movement just increased visibility and exposure. Stationary shelter, when chosen intelligently, often reduced risk much more than constant flight. The real application is understanding movement as a calculated tool, not just a reflex. Survivors moved deliberately, not continuously. Timing, in fact, mattered more than speed. World War II survival was not about bravado or folk wisdom. It was about judgment under uncertainty. Many well-meaning tips failed because they ignored scale, technology, and human behavior. If this breakdown added depth to how you understand civilian survival, subscribe to After the Sirens. Share this video with someone who values real history and leave a comment with which myth surprised you most. This channel exists to preserve truth, not comfort.